I thought we would do another video of me talking about things. I asked people what they would like me to talk about, and it was no one other but Ben Walsh of the amazing Gravitas pen company, who left a question. And it said, I'd like to know where the the pen companies are failing the pen community. I sent Ben a message once in my fairly terrible Irish accent, and he said that's an excellent attempt at a Hollywood Irish accent. Anyway, Ben is a super nice guy, so I think it's a very interesting question. Where are pen companies failing the pen community? Well, if you're the Gravitas pen company, nowhere. As far as I'm concerned, although you can't please everyone. So that's a profound question, and one that I actually gave quite a bit of thought, as opposed to just making things up on the fly, as I never ever do in videos. The biggest area for me where pen companies fail the pen community is by producing pens that do not write. That to me is the biggest issue, the biggest gripe I have. And I would love to say it's uncommon, but it's not. At all levels, all price classes, although I must say I see it most in the very expensive range of pens. Pen companies create pens that don't write, or, because that is not necessarily enormously common, but pens that don't write properly. That I think is very common. And what I mean by that is not a nib that is scratchy, because that writes. It may not write the way you like it to write, but that's not an objective error, that's just not a very smooth nib. An objective error is when you have a nib that skips, hard starts, stops writing, maybe due to an air exchange issue. Those are issues that I think are objective. That's not a matter of preference. This is too smooth or not smooth enough. But it is a matter of this pen does not write. And when I say pen, I guess I mean nib. It could be the feed, but I think you know what I mean. You put it to the paper and it simply will not write properly. It skips continuously. It does all sorts of things you don't want it to do. Sometimes it may not even write. It happens rarely. But again, skipping, hard starts, that's pretty common. What I don't understand is that pen companies are fine with sending out products like that. A nib that does not write, a pen that does not write, should not have passed quality control. Now, I realize very well that that is very easy for me to say. I don't make pens. If I would be a small pen maker, and I would have to hand test every single pen that leaves my, let's say, workshop, probably not a warehouse, a single one person operation. Yeah. I don't know if I would have time. I don't know if I would have the time to test every single pen. I guess that depends on how many orders I get in a day, week, month, whatever. But still, I understand there are certain limitations just in the time that you have. However, I find that it's often not the small pen makers who struggle with this issue. They often test their nibs. I know that Brian Gray, the Edison Pen Company, I don't know if he still does it, but back in the day, every single nib that left his company was tested and was tuned if necessary. That is a lot of work, but at the end of the day, I also think it yields the most satisfied customers, because you get a pen, you ink it up, and it writes straight out of the box. Again, I'm not talking about a nib is a little scratchy. I'm not talking about the nib is a little too dry, is a little too wet for my likings. Those are subjective factors. I'm talking about objective errors, like I have a nib from, say, an Italian company, and it's made of a certain material, say palladium, and it simply will not properly write. It skips all the time. That nib should not have passed quality control. And my favorite analogy, even though I'm not a car person, is that of cars. Imagine what would happen if you would make cars and every 50 kilometers the engine shuts down entirely. Because that's kind of like what a skipping nib is, isn't it? Like it writes a little bit and it skips. Maybe it stops. Prime it. If you would make cars like that, you would be out of business. Under a year, you would be out of business if you would not improve your manufacturing process. But in the pen community, it's become totally acceptable to do that. Totally acceptable. And then you hear things, and I myself have said this, like I have bought expensive pens that I liked, and then I send them to a nibmeister, and I paid to get the nib tuned because it didn't write properly. And you spend maybe 10% of what you've spent on that pen at a nibmeister's. But why? Why is it on the customer to then fix that problem? Wouldn't it make sense that you don't send out non-functional nibs to begin with? Now, as I said, because that was the argument I was trying to make, I have found that with most smaller pen companies, it's not really an issue. Sure, I'm sure that everybody has a story about that guy, this guy, whatever. Like, of course. Once in a while, something may slip under the radar. Sure, people make mistakes. I don't think anyone would argue that. It can happen. But I'm talking about big companies. There was a time, and that time has passed now as far as I'm concerned, but there was a time that I would say 60 to 70% of the Viscontis I would get in to review would have significant nib issues, to the point that some of them barely wrote. That's a pretty substantial issue, would we not say? Like that's it. Now, again, I have the feeling at this point it's better. They have stopped the palladium nibs. They're now back to gold. I've experienced a lot fewer issues with the gold nibs vis-a-vis the palladium nibs, but still, it's strange that for such a period of time there were that many issues. And it's not just Visconti. There are other companies that have the same type of issue. And oftentimes it's the very high-end companies. And I don't understand that. Is it because they don't care? Is it because they just accept it as a write-off? That sure, we're going to get a certain percentage of pens back. We'll put another nib on it. I've heard stories from people who have sent back pens. So I'm not trying to pick on Visconti. I have a number of Viscontis. I like the brand. But I mean, I have heard stories of people who had to send back Visconti 2, 3, 4 times before the nib they had actually wrote. That's pretty strange. Again, draw an analogy. Anything you buy, a laptop, a car, a stove, it doesn't matter. If it would function that way, nobody would accept that. Strange. So that, in my mind, creating pens that do not write, that's an area where certain pen companies have failed the pen community. The other thing I'll be briefer about, but I also think there is an issue with hideous designs. Now, I'm straying here very much into the very subjective field, but I have certainly seen some very expensive pens that I found absolutely hideous. Now, having said that, there's always one person who likes those pens. There's always someone. But I have found, this is again, I'm talking about the high echelon of pens. Incredibly expensive pens, some of them $2,750, that were really fairly hideous. And it seemed to be the consensus because I reviewed it and most people say, wow, this thing is ugly. Which is interesting, right? Now, of course, this is also a matter of, yeah, but that's a little bit of taste though. That's a bit of subjective nature. Some people like this and other people like that. I know that. So that's never a matter I would push. But I sometimes feel that certain very high-end pen companies kind of lose track of pen users and move towards creating pens that are hideous, that are very uncomfortable to use because they have all kinds of things bolted and tacked on them to make them resemble great characters. And those pens are just uncomfortable. Those typically write, but they're very uncomfortable to use because there's all kinds of things sticking out of them. And I think that's a shame. Now, again, some people really love that, but what I'm trying to say is I find that some of these high-end companies are moving away from creating functional pens and moving towards, let's create something so that we can sell it for $2,000 to high-end collectors. And that's a way to make money. I understand that. But I find that a financially understandable but not very great decision. Not if you wish to serve a pen community, but I guess those companies simply don't care. So there's that. Those are my two gripes. These are my two issues. And let me know what you think. Let me know what your biggest issues are, what you think are some examples of where pen companies fail the pen community. Maybe how that can be resolved. If you agree with what I said, if you disagree with what I said, and that's, of course, it's fine too. And if you have any other things that you would like me to talk about in future videos like this. Ben, thank you for the question. Hope this was useful, and I'll gladly see you later. Bye-bye.